Although many royal families realized Leopold's death was due to haemophilia, the gains to be made by marrying a descendant of Queen Victoria blinded them to the terrible risks of inheriting the disease.
Queen Victoria's children went on to populate the houses of Europe with not seeming to know or care that haemophilia might have been an issue. And I think in reality what was more important was their royal blood, not the possibility of tainted haemophilia blood.
The trouble with haemophilia is that one never exactly knows when it's going to strike. Not every daughter is necessarily a carrier, and not every son necessarily suffers from it. So therefore they couldn't really stop marriages because of the risk of haemophilia. It was simply a risk they felt they were prepared to take, to close their eyes to.
By the end of the 19th century, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was scouring Europe for a wife. Although he ruled over an enormous empire, it was falling apart at the seams. What Russia needed now was strong leadership and a stable monarchy. But Nicholas was a sentimental man, and despite objections from his parents, he set his heart on marrying Alexandra, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Unwittingly, he had fallen in love with a woman who would destroy the Russian dynasty.
It wasn't thought important that there was haemophilia or suspected haemophilia in her family, because Queen Victoria had suggested that there was no haemophilia in the British royal family, and it was very unclear whether Alix would be a carrier or not.
Despite his parents' misgivings, the marriage produced 4 beautiful daughters. But all hopes for the royal succession depended on Alexandra producing a son.
It was absolutely essential that Alexandra should have a son, because in Russia, daughters couldn't inherit the throne. So after she'd produced 3 and then a 4th daughter, they were absolutely desperate for a son. And eventually, when he was born, this was a cause of enormous rejoicing and great relief, of course.
But at just 6 weeks old, their worst fears were confirmed when the baby, Alexei, began to bleed from the navel. He was a haemophiliac. Queen Victoria's gene had been inherited by the only heir to the Russian throne. It was a disaster for the royal family. In public, Alexei was frequently carried by a sailor to hide the fact that his joints were so swollen he could rarely walk. But it was still vital that he was groomed for the throne, and so in periods of respite, he went on parade with his father. It was essential that the Russian people saw him as a future ruler.
It was thought that they had to keep it absolutely to themselves that Alexei was ill. Had it been known that the only son was potentially fatally ill, then the dynasty would have been weakened.
Alexandra realized that she was responsible for bringing haemophilia into the Russian royal family, as her brother, Fritzi, had died of the disease. But at the time, she had no way of knowing that the odds of passing the disease on were as high as 50-50.
Of course, she had this terrible sense of guilt because she was the carrier. She was responsible for introducing it. So she was desperate.
Alexandra had no one to share the blame. She maintained vigil at Alexei's bedside, tormented by his pain. The doctors could offer no help. A member of court wrote,
"Think of the torture of that mother. A mother who knew that she herself was the cause of those sufferings, that she had transmitted the terrible disease against which human science was powerless."
There was no one Alexandra could turn to when Alexei was ill. Her only refuge was religion.
She'd taken it on wholeheartedly and become deeply involved with and deeply emotionally attached to the Russian Orthodox Church. But she was also always on the lookout for holy men, mystics, who she thought could help her with her son, could bring her closer to God, could purge this terrible disease. The doctors didn't seem to be able to help her, so she looked for help elsewhere.
In 1905, she met a holy man who brought hope of curing her son. The meeting was to change her life and that of the Russian royal family. The man's name was Rasputin.
Rasputin seemed to have a strange power to calm the child and also calm his mother. It's known that Rasputin had some sort of hypnotic abilities or powers. There were several occasions when Rasputin's appearance seemed to halt the bleeding and cure Alexei. Or at least that's how it was read, and certainly that's how Alexandra read it, and that's why she would have no truck with anybody who spoke badly of Rasputin.
Rasputin gained enormous influence in the family, as they believed he had mysterious powers to cure Alexei's suffering. These powers were put to the test when the royal family were on holiday in Poland in 1913. The journey there was a nightmare. The rough road caused an old injury of Alexei's to start to bleed. His whole trip was agony. But worse was yet to come. For 10 days, the bleeding continued, with no sign of stopping. There was nothing the doctors could do. It looked like Alexei would die. They even had public death notices prepared. Finally, they telegrammed Rasputin, who had stayed behind in Siberia, to ask him what they should do.
He sent one back, which said, "Do not grieve, the little one will not die. Only don't let the doctors bother him too much." And this had an immediate calming effect upon Alexandra, who was desperate by this stage. And remarkably enough, in a day or two, Alexei began to get better, having been at death's door.
The recovery was pure coincidence, but the royal family fell under Rasputin's spell. He gained extraordinary power over them, and when Nicholas joined the troops at the front, Alexandra left Rasputin in charge. It was a mistake that would destroy the family.
During the First World War, Rasputin had only to say, we've got to sack the Minister of the Interior, we've got to sack this one or that one, for Alexandra to tell Nicholas, you've got to sack him, and this is what they would do. In the end, the whole cabinet was simply appointees of Rasputin. Whatever he said simply carried the weight. Now, the aristocracy, especially the members of the royal family, they were very worried about this kind of very malign influence which he had over the Empress and over the Emperor.
The monarchy was becoming discredited because these rumours were flying about of sexual relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin, all sorts of debauchery in high circles. And as time went on, people were more and more determined that Rasputin had to go.
Rasputin was murdered in 1916 by members of the aristocracy. But it was too late to save the monarchy. Revolution swept through Russia, and on the 17th of July 1918, Alexei and his family were herded into a small room on the pretense of having their photo taken. They were executed by firing squad. Queen Victoria's haemophilia gene had played a terrible part in bringing to an end the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty.